This project is analyzing the spatial patterns of controlled burns using UAVs. Prairie ecosystems contain many varieties of grass, insect, flower, tree, bird, and mammal species. However, grasslands have suffered from large-scale land use changes due to drainage, agricultural intensification, and conversion to arable lands or forest plantations. Thus, many plant and animal species adapted to grasslands became threatened in the past years. As prairies become more vital habitats to rare native plants and species, these ecosystems also benefit humans in numerous ways. For one, prairie grasses improve surrounding water quality by controlling sediment and consequently reducing erosion and runoff. Plants hold topsoil in place, and their roots act as filtration system as water travels to the underground aquifers. Restored prairies also sequester significant amounts of organic carbon into the soil, which effectively reduces net carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. Because prairies act as carbon sinks, the importance of the restoration will rise as the need to mitigate global climate change intensifies. In order to preserve high-quality prairies for native plants and animals, it is vital to remove encroaching trees and shrubs, control invasive species, and create microhabitats for specialist forms. It has been suggested that to fulfill these goals, prescribed burning can be a viable and cost-effective option in places where traditional management practices, such as grazing or mowing, are not feasible anymore. One study targeting the effects of fire on plant communities found that fire improves species richness, diversity, competitive interactions, and plant structure. Results from another study suggested that leaving unburnt patches is a viable management tool in open landscapes because it supports plant diversity and it does not threaten the majority of insects. After evaluating post-fire vegetation responses in large and small burned patches, scientists found that the size and severity of these patch burns have significant effects of most biotic responses. In conclusion, successful prairie burns are patchy, in which only portions of the prairie is burned. Currently, wildlife monitoring is conducted by foot, car, ship, and by manned plane. While these methods of collection generate useful data, they are costly and time-consuming. This limits the amount of regularity that they may be employed for data collection. The most common approach to classifying land cover types and detecting monitoring changes in land cover is to use satellite imagery and data. Unfortunately, most of this imagery is very low resolution, making detecting change on small-scale sites very difficult. Where previous methods of measuring conservation efforts have been lacking, drones have become increasingly useful as a conservation tool. Over the last 15 years, they've become cheaper and more readily available. The Nature Conservancy has not yet employed this groundbreaking technology to study the effects of small-scale prairie burns. My research is in conjunction with the needs of the Nature Conservancy and their pre- and post-burn restoration efforts. Weaver Dunes Preserve is an important prairie remnant that contains a wide variety of rare native plant and animal species. Open sand blowouts, dry ridges, and sheltered swales all support species that have adapted to the hot, dry environment of a sand prairie. Thousands of years ago, glacial meltwaters carried large quantities of sand to this area. Due to the convergence of the Mississippi, Zumbo, and Chippewa rivers, a formation of sand terraces emerged. These rivers slowed meltwaters enough to leave sand deposits up to 150 feet deep. Eventually, wind and water carved these deposits into sand dunes, and a prairie ecosystem, very unique to this area, was created. This gift displays the burn history of the Weaver Dunes Preserve. This helped us identify an interesting study area that was very recently burned. The yellow plots represent the area that was burned that year. Red plots indicate prairie burns in past years. Our study area is focused in a recently burned area in the Weaver Dunes Preserve in Kellogg, Minnesota. The Nature Conservancy is restoring high-quality prairie habitat via prescribed burns. This research is designed to assess landscape features that are associated with effective or patchy burns. This project is based on a 3D model which generates an aerial map of the location and extent of ash and also identifies landscape features that shape patterns of ash at multiple scales. Flight patterns of our study will be generated in the Map Pilot app. Altitude, pixel resolution, and photo overlap are adjusted accordingly to maximize data collected in the flight. The aerial imagery and data collected by the drone will be processed in the Drone to Map software. The Drone to Map software will generate a digital terrain model, a digital surface model, and an orthomosaic image. This model is derived from two drone layers, an orthomosaic image and an NDVI layer. The extent of the location of ash is a judgment call and made based on color bands from within the NDVI layer. Then, four independent variables, slope, aspect, elevation, and surface roughness, were derived from the digital terrain model from the drone. This model can then be used for future research by inputting data from future flights. This image is derived from 105 UAV JPEGs stitched together in Drone to Map. This is a newly burned parcel of prairie at the Weaver Dunes Preserve. This is an image of the same area, however this is the digital terrain layer produced in Drone to Map, which displays the terrain of the surface of this burned prairie. This graphic is derived from the model shown previously. This displays our different landscape variables at each of the three scales. After mapping patterns of ash and independent variables, exploratory regression analysis is used to determine the most predictive landscape features of ash at three different scales. We wanted to know at what scale of analysis do variables have the highest impact on the presence of ash. Using the exploratory regression tool, 15 trials were run. Our results, based on the data from earlier, most predictive at the 5-meter scale. Below is the statistical significance of each of the landscape variables at each associated scale. In conclusion, aspect was always statistically significant even as the scale changed. There is a strong association with north-facing slopes and the presence of ash. Elevation was the second most important variable, however its importance varied according to scale. At the 1-meter scale, elevation was not statistically significant. At the 2 and 5-meter scale, elevation became 100% statistically significant. This indicates that the larger your study area is, the more impact elevation has on your burn patches. Slope and surface roughness had less strong associations with the presence of ash and showed no significant patterns across scale sizes. This graphic explains the effect of the landscape on burn dynamics. First, we made some assumptions. One, that fuel or biomass is unevenly distributed throughout a prairie. Areas with high concentrations of fuel are more likely to burn, and that prescribed burns are conducted on days where the wind is still. We found that aspect and elevation were our strongest variables related to the presence of ash. For aspect, we initially thought that south-facing slopes would burn more easily because they tend to be hotter and drier, while north-facing slopes tend to be shaded, cool, and wet. Surprisingly, our results pointed to an association of north-facing slopes with the presence of burned patches. This could be attributed to the moisture collecting on cool, wet slopes, and thus more biomass or fuel thrive on north slopes. As for elevation, we found that its importance depended on what scale you look at. Ash was found on low-lying areas at a decline, and this could follow in nutrients collecting at low elevations and water collecting in those low areas. Thus, plants are more likely to thrive in these areas also. Slope was less associated to ash, but where we had steep slopes, there was less ash. So this could be due to nutrients and water running downhill, and thus more plants being on gentle slopes. If you have plants thriving in a very specific locations in a prairie, these clustered plants die out and dry in the fall. When the spring comes and prescribed burns begin, there is more biomass or fuel in these locations and thus a greater presence of ash. As our fourth variable, surface roughness was not as found to be statistically significant to ash. We had some unexpected results in which prairie burned at low elevations and north-facing slopes. This pattern could be attributed to the removal of fuel as a result of prairie burns. If this is the case, the presence of fuel would flip from one burn to the next. Future research could assess soil and moisture content in lower elevations at the base of the sand dunes. The model is used to analyze our drone imagery, will be used in future courses at the University of St. Thomas. This model allows for the monitoring of prairie restoration and prescribed burns over time. The information gathered from future research will help the Nature Conservancy focus their prairie restoration efforts according to the landscape variables.